Wait, so this is on, right?
All right. Andre, sit there and face there.
Yeah.
And then you want me to just talk about the idea of decentralization and how this is going to create competition.
Is that going to solve these problems?
Okay.
Some of what problems will it solve? What problems won't it solve? And then I'll launch into questions.
Okay.
Please
all right.
We're about to get started. Thank you.
Nobody who's your friend is
Go to the wrong event.
Okay. Well. Thank you for sticking around for the last panel of the day. We're going to, I've counseled everyone to be very energetic and get into lots of arguments so that we'll keep you guys awake. I'm Jesse Eisinger. I'm a reporter at ProPublica, which is a nonprofit investigative news organization. And I don't really do introductions. That's what the panel, that's what the materials are for. So I think what we're going to do on this panel today is solve all the questions that have been raised earlier. We're going to figure everything out. There's going to be some overlap in questions, and then I think what we want to do really is kind of push the forward. So to my right, I've got some esteemed antitrust economists who are going to kind of try to address the question of how do we measure these markets? How do we think about market power? And then we're going to talk more about, with folks on my left, about what the problems really are here. And then we're going to try to come up with some actual solutions and discuss what's feasible and what isn't. So Carl and Fiona, would you take it away with your opening remarks?
Sure. So what we thought we'd talk about for a little while is the issue of market definition, market power, and then what I referred to in the morning as the kind of anti-competitive theory of harm, which you would actually need if you wanted to bring some enforcement action under the antitrust laws. So market definition traditionally works as follows. We think about a hypothetical market and ask if we raised price by, let's say, 5%, would enough consumers leave that they would defeat that price increase and make it unprofitable, or would that be a profitable thing to do? So we could say, let's imagine online advertising is our market. If prices went up in online advertising by 5%, would those advertisers leave for television or billboards or some other alternative way of getting to people? We also would want to think about the other side of the platform, namely the consumers. So let's say I'm on Facebook and we raise price to consumers by 5%. Well, what is that? You might say they're not paying anything. Well, remember, they're giving their data. So we think about that as the price, and we'd say, suppose they had to give 5% more data, or they lost 5% in terms of privacy protection or something like that. Would that drive those consumers to a different social media site? And we could do the same thing with search engines. If online, if advertising an online search engine for a hypothetical monopolist, so Google and Bing put together, DuckDuckGo in there, if that went up by 5%, would advertisers go somewhere else? And similarly with the consumer side, if the consumer's giving up some kind of quality or privacy. Once we have those markets set, let's imagine their online search is one and we find that online advertising is another, then your traditional way of assessing market power would be something like market shares. And this morning we've heard shares in the high 60s to 70s to 90s. Those are all sufficiently high shares that one would conclude that there was market power if you had that kind of market definition. So that's just a quick overview of sort of the way you start.
All right, let me pick up on that. I think it's very important. We're primarily talking about Google and Facebook for this conversation. We'll bring in Amazon as well, the other company that's gotten a lot of attention today. And as many of you I'm sure have heard, we economists, we often call these two-sided markets, although I don't like that term. But we've got the users, and then we've got the advertisers, right? So the other group that I would say we want to pay attention to in terms of economic power here and defining markets would be the entities that want to be found, okay, when you're searching. Because if you're worried about search bias on Google, for example, if the algorithm is biased against your site, then you're going to be disadvantaged, even if you're not an advertiser or a user. Okay, so those are the constituencies. And I think Fiona has pointed out that the traditional market definition exercise we could do either by looking at the consumer side or the advertiser side. You were really talking about both. So I think that's important. You heard from some of our distinguished antitrust colleagues this morning, I think Kevin Murphy and Dennis Carl and Dick Schmalensee. Often what we antitrusters do is say, oh, we've seen this before, right? We've had these problems before. We've had these issues before. And I tend to fall into that too, but not to say, oh, so there's nothing new under the sun or not to worry about it, but there is learning we can have. So for example, DOJ for many years handled radio mergers, okay, and they had the advertising side and the listener side. Okay, credit cards is another area that's got a lot of attention where you've got the merchant side and the cardholder side. So these are different. I'm not saying they're the same, but there's learning, both academic and case law and practitioner, that can be brought to bear on these two sides. The only other thing I'd say on the market definition piece is we also look at what we call price discrimination markets. So we can look for market power over particular groups. So I'm sure Facebook would say, oh, not only do we not have any market power more or less on the user side because people can spend their time so many different ways, as Zuckerberg more or less said in Congress, I guess. But I could imagine them saying, I don't know, that they'd say, oh, we also don't have market power on the advertising side because advertisers run these campaigns and they sprinkle their advertising money around in all these different ways, and we have to compete against all these other outlets for advertising. Okay, not a crazy argument and a fairly standard argument when was talking about advertising markets. And then where the analysis tends to go would be, well, maybe there are certain targeted types of advertisers where Facebook is really a lot more effective way of getting to customers because they're targeted. And they would know that. And the advertisers might very well know that based on the campaigns they're running. So then we could have targeted or price discrimination markets, and we might be concerned about harm in those narrower groupings. Okay? But I think as we move on from market definition and market power to more conduct and what we do about it, I think for this conversation, I would just say, let's just stipulate, assume, whatever, that Facebook and Google have significant market power in some of these areas, and then go on to see significant economic power. What can or should antitrust do about that?
Mm-hmm. And I would just add, I think you could, it'd be interesting to pursue the price discrimination market on the consumer side also. I don't know quite how that would go, but I think that's a really interesting area.
Okay. And part of what we've been talking about, perhaps in here, is trying to think like theories that haven't really been developed in terms of market power or in terms of possible conduct, to think where might this all go in antitrust land with these big tech platforms? Because we have some things that have happened already, but we're looking forward. Yeah.
Are we stipulating, Carl, for the purposes of argument, or are we stipulating because you believe it that Google, Facebook, and Amazon have market power that is concerned?
Well, you lump them all together like that. It's so hard to answer.
This is the classic antitrust economist trick. To
we have
disaggregate.
a little more.
Yeah.
Can we keep going?
Okay, you go.
Yeah.
You keep going, and then we'll
so
talk
once you
later.
have this basis, then you would ask, well, can you use the antitrust laws to go after these firms? And the answer is, well, you can if they've committed a violation of those antitrust laws. Not just because they're big or they did something you don't like. So the question then comes, do we need some new antitrust law for that? And the answer is no, not in principle. The antitrust laws are written in a general enough way. They prohibit mergers that tend to lessen competition and exclusionary conduct, and those apply in every sector of the economy, and they apply here. So what I mentioned this morning is what we just haven't really seen out in the literature is a nice, tight theory of harm that says, here's the conduct, and here's the way in which it harms competition, and that's why it's a violation of the antitrust laws. And that's what you would need before you could bring just a traditional, ordinary enforcement case against one of these platforms.
And if you break it up into the two areas, mergers and then conduct, or bad behavior, bad conduct, we've talked a bit, I think we'll talk some more about the It's totally possible. You know, I could see antitrust doing more, and I've actually written that I would hope antitrust would do more to prevent large incumbent companies, including tech companies, from buying smaller companies that are threats before those threats mature. Okay? It's a hard thing to do in practice. It's a hard thing to do in the case law, but it's totally within the realm of how, you know, there are cases like that, and we can move it. And, you know, people talk about Facebook's acquisitions, and, you know, we obviously talk about WhatsApp or Instagram. So have they, you know, so we can talk about that sort of thing. That's one whole area. The other would be the conduct. And I've been asking people for a good year or two since this whole has been bubbling up. All right, tell me what you think the conduct is with any of these companies. Tell me what it is, and then we could talk about, does that seem like an antitrust violation, or it could be, or should it be investigated? And I haven't gotten that much, okay? I hear a lot. Look, I'm pretty unhappy with Facebook right now, but I haven't heard anything that sounded like a real antitrust violation.
Except for the mergers.
No, I'm talking about the conduct side
Right,
now,
right.
okay? And on conduct, I think it's really important to distinguish two types of concerns we'd have. One would be the company uses its monopoly position to leverage that and somehow take over adjacent spaces, okay? And the EC case against Google, I do work for Google, I work for Google on that case, is claiming that Google took its main search monopoly and used it to take over or stifle competition in an adjacent market for comparison shopping services. Okay, I think the case is very weak, but it's that type of leverage extension argument. And that's one thing. But a lot of the talk today has been about what are we going to do about the core monopoly or power that these companies have. And to go after that sort of case, we would traditionally look for, is there conduct where there's a competitor who's threatening to come in and challenge or attack that monopoly position, and the company has somehow excluded them or stiff-armed them to disable that. And this is what we had in the Microsoft case, actually. It wasn't about the cases that actually played out. It was not Microsoft leveraging its monopoly power to take over browsers. Actually, that was part of the case that was brought, but that didn't end up, that wasn't where the case ended up. It was a tying case. That was part of the case, but that part the appeals court didn't like. The part that stood up and is an important precedent now is Microsoft defending its desktop operating system monopoly through certain conduct. Okay, so that would be the big case against one of these companies that could warrant substantial remedy if they were seen to unfairly exclude competitors who could have toppled the monopoly. So I will repeat my plea or request, what are those conduct, any of these companies, tell me what it is, and then, you know, and tell the antitrust agencies for that matter, and that's where we would go. And that's pretty much what antitrust could do, that and, of course, the acquisition side, the M&A side.
And what's particularly important about these platforms is very often they have direct network effects. So if you think about Google, if you think about Facebook, you're on there to communicate with your friends. That effectively means that there's a winner-take-all market. Nobody wants to be on a social network where their friends are not. Okay, that's pretty boring. And so what you're going to see is competition for the market, not competition in the market. Okay? So there's going to be competition to become that monopolist that everyone coordinates on, and you're not going to see two social networks with 50% share. At least maybe the teenagers are all on one, and then the old people are all on another one. But you're not gonna have the teenagers dividing up. So what does that mean for antitrust enforcement? It means, I think, going back to what Carl said about these Facebook acquisitions of small, threatening competitors, that's very important. You wouldn't expect to see a merger. You wouldn't expect to see Facebook buying a competitor that had a 30% share. There's no such thing. You know, in a market with strong network externalities, the competitor has a 1% share or a 99% share. So we are going to need to pay attention to those 1% share companies because they actually are the source of competition in that kind of market. And then the last one we wanted to talk about was Amazon. What theories have we heard out there about Amazon that would fall into this antitrust bucket? And I think one is monopsony. I don't know if you want to.
Right. So, but before we jump to that, the one theory that's been developed is predatory pricing, basically. That they're, and we certainly heard from folks this morning. Are they driving out other retailers with low prices? Or on the but then on the supplier side, are they squeezing the book publishers or the music industry? Okay, that would be some sort of upstream buyer power. Okay, as far as I can see, the predatory pricing type of case downstream, I'm not seeing it from anything I've seen, but I don't see the evidence that their prices are below cost, and I don't see that they tend to have that big a share in various markets downstream, but I'm open to that evidence. I know people disagree about that. I think the upstream stuff is more, potentially could go somewhere, but the antitrust, we'd have fairly demanding standards, I guess, to have an antitrust case, which would be, what would be the upstream market they're buying? Is it online retailers through their marketplace who could only get to the market through Amazon? And what about eBay, for example, or what about other retailers? So, Walmart's making a big play. So I just don't know where that would go in terms of the facts. The fact that they're big and growing is not enough. But again, I think it'd be interesting if people could develop the fact base and the theory of harm, and on the upstream side, the monopoly power side, if you will, with the key thing being not just that they bargain for low prices from their suppliers, which in and of itself is not, but that there would be some output restricting effect over time because they'd squeeze suppliers, such as was suggested in the music industry, for example, and that could be tested.
And I think another way you could think about the output restriction, which I haven't seen developed but would be an interesting direction if the facts were there, is if Amazon's going to take a supplier and kind of expropriate their investments in something, their new toaster or whatever, then that might lead to insufficient investments in new goods. I don't want to be a retailer that invents something great to sell through the Amazon website because they're going to see it, take it over, do it themselves, and I won't be able to reap the rewards of my innovation or something like that. So there's that dynamic kind of harm as well as what you were just talking about, which is lower prices and kind of static benefits.
Okay, so we're going to wrap up our little intro here and turn it back to everybody. But I think, to me, one takeaway I'd hope you'd all get is there are lines of inquiry to be pursued, theories of harm, evidence that can be accumulated in any of these companies. I haven't seen that really developed yet. But antitrust is a tough way to go. You have to have these elements, and you make the case, and it takes a long time, and the case law is not necessarily very favorable to some of these theories. And a lot of what I think the concerns that we've heard today, and we'll probably hear tomorrow, are not fundamentally antitrust, right? They're political, or there are other issues about how the role in our society. And so just don't expect more of antitrust than the type of things we're talking about here, which have to do with competition and monopolization.
All right, thank you, guys. So we have a plea for a theory of harm, careful students of this panel will have noticed that originally it had a different title. It was going to be called something about how is free really free, and Andre said that's an incredibly boring title because
I didn't quite say
because everybody knows it's completely obvious it's not free. End of discussion. We all go for drinks, so I think we're going to talk about market failures and theories of harm here in the next half. So Andre, take it away.
Sure. So Jay and I are going to talk about market failures. As a general perspective, I think of multi-sided platforms, so all the ones that we mentioned, but generally speaking, multi-sided platforms. There are two types of market failures. There are market failures that are contained within the platform, and there are market failures that basically spill over outside the platform. So let me explain what I mean. If you're a multi-sided platform, by definition, you're kind of like running a market. And in some sense, you're acting as a regulator for your own market, except, of course, you're a for-profit regulator and you're trying to maximize profits. Now, in doing so, obviously, you want to take care. You want to make sure that the market functions properly. For instance, I want to make sure that sellers don't abuse buyers. If there's asymmetric information, I want to put mechanisms in place that give the sellers the right incentives and protect buyers from sellers. And I think by and large, all platforms, so Airbnb, Facebook, Google, it doesn't matter if it's buyers or sellers. It could be users and advertisers or users with third-party apps. there's always this potential for one party to take advantage of the other. I think by and large, all of these platforms are pretty good at solving for these market failures. So these are the market failures that are internal to the platform. Now, I'm not saying it's easy. There's a fundamental struggle between I'm a platform, I don't fully control what the third parties are doing, but I may be held responsible. So let's say if I don't know, if I have a bad experience on an Airbnb, I go to some Airbnb apartment and it turns out to be a shack, it's not what I ordered. Now, I understand that Airbnb doesn't control that seller and they did whatever they could, but if it's a bad experience, I may still never go to Airbnb again, so I'm holding Airbnb responsible. So they have to kind of deal with that. So there's control versus responsibility. Now, that's already it's not easy, but that's just talking about market failures within the platform. I think what's become very prominent these days with what's going on with Facebook is that there are very severe market failures that spill over outside the platform. So this is transactions or interactions that happen on the platform that have consequences outside the platform scope. That one's a lot tougher because if I'm the platform, it's unclear. In fact, it's actually pretty clear that they don't have incentives to really take care or to even worry about market failures outside the platform. So this is Facebook over the last 2 years, this was incredible to me. They would repeatedly say, we're just a platform. How could you hold us responsible for, results of elections or stuff that's happening outside? Now, it's clear they're an enabler, so I get the argument, right? This is what's different about platform businesses. I'm not fully controlling. I'm just enabling something. Now, they're enabling something that has negative consequences. So in the case of Facebook, maybe it's misinformation. In the case of Airbnb, the outside market failure could be something like, the impact, so the overall rents in a city go up and it displaces people who work in that city. So that's something a lot of cities are worried about and they're talking to Airbnb about this. Each of these platforms does have these kind of market failures that spill outside. And I think the issue there is that these market failures are not internalized. The business model of these platforms is not attuned to account for these market failures until someone says something about it. Now, keeping regulators aside for a second, I still think it's extremely myopic, and as Facebook discovered to their sorrow, it's very myopic to basically just be completely, just focus on what they're doing on the platform and not care at all about what's going on outside, what results from the spillovers from their platform. Because at some point, if something bad happens, like say, election scandal or something like that, well, now public opinion turns against them, and we go to the other extreme in which they're held responsible for absolutely everything. Which I don't think, by the way, I don't think that's fair either. Again, they don't have full control, but you end up with this problem that Facebook has now, which is basically anything they do, every bad action that's kind of correlated or stems from their platform, they're held responsible for it. So now the question, so this was more strategy, like you have to worry about this if you're a platform. Now, what's the regulatory standpoint? I think this is actually tricky. So of course we want to worry about market failures that are not internalized. Textbook, Econ 101 example is factory polluting the river, right? So they produce something, it spills into the river, and it's bad. We tax it. For example, one solution is we tax the output. With platforms, it's a little bit trickier because again, they don't have full control over all the actions. They're responsible for the negative harm. So I think a regulated response that says, okay, there are these market failures. We're just going to hold you responsible for anything that stems from your actions outside the platform. I don't think that's the right answer. There should be some accountability and some responsibility, and there should be. We should definitely ask these questions. To what extent should we hold these platforms responsible for stuff that's spilling outside? But it's definitely a lot harder than, say, for traditional product and service companies. So I don't have a good answer for what the percentage responsibility is, but I definitely think it's something. Just like, for example, after a while we decide, okay, well, tobacco is bad for you. We should, we basically start to put some restrictions, disclosure rules on the harms of tobacco. I definitely envision something like this for Facebook. You should be aware that consuming Facebook more than 3 hours a day makes you stupid. If there's research, by the way, I think there's actually sociological, psychological research on this. If we find that's truly the case, I think there should be something like that. But I tread very careful in trying to sort of give full responsibility for these market failures to the platforms. Let me pause here. I'm happy to
good.
react more.
Well, you have an hour and 4 minutes to come up with your solution. I'm not going to let you off with.
Okay.
We want a regulatory solution.
All right, cool.
Jay, do you want to elaborate on the failures that you see in the markets?
Yeah, sure. So we talked a lot about Facebook and Google, and as we know, the business model for these two firms is to provide the services for free and get revenues from elsewhere, especially from advertising. So I'll talk about some of the market failures in this kind of a business model. And also we talk a lot about market power of these two companies, but actually the market failure I'm going to talk about, this will be actually independent of a market structure. Okay? Even though there are many, many firms, this kind of problem will still exist. And the reason is the problem. So at least I think of two main reasons for market failure in this type of market. The first one is that users and the consumers, they pay with attention and personal information. And we know that actually for proper functioning of the market economy, one necessary condition is that when the transacting parties, okay, they should know what they are exchanging exactly. But when you pay with personal information, actually you don't know how much you pay because the process, your information will be used by these firms. This is very opaque and non-transparent. Okay? So this is one issue because the information asymmetry, how your information will be used, that could lead to market failure. And also another complication is that even though consumers know that how your information might be used, it looks like there seems to be some cognitive dissonance in the following sense. So people are asked how much you value privacy. People will say that we value a lot. But when you actually see how they behave, their behavior seems to indicate otherwise. So this could be also another, consideration we have to take we have to think about. And another one is there could be also some kind of information externality. In the morning there was some discussion about information. The privacy. This is actually similar to pollution. So here what I'm saying is that even though you gather your own information, but if many other people reveal their information, actually there's some technology called like a doppelganger method, which is basically firms that can use big data and artificial intelligence. They can match whatever information you provide. They can find somebody else who might have similar characteristics and may have some information about you. So if all other people actually reveal information, then actually the firm will eventually find out about yourself. So maybe you will be more willing to provide your own information. So there could be it could be also some kind of a collective decision problem might be present. And the second related reason is that personal data is information, and as economists we know that information is a very special property, which is actually public in nature, which means that information can be used over and over again without wear and tear. And also, if you sell your information, it can be also sold and resold ad infinitum. So I see some kind of like analogy with actually technology licensing. So technology licensing is a sale of information. And when you look at actually licensing contract, the contract can be very elaborate because you are aware of this kind of problem. So you actually put a lot of restrictions on the contract. For instance, you could have put in something like a field of use restriction. So basically, they limit only a particular purpose, so not something else. Also, if we are concerned that maybe the licensee might develop better technology that will make your technology obsolete, then maybe you can include the so-called grant back clause. Okay, so there could be a lot of restrictions in the contract because of this information problem. But we cannot. But technology licensing is taking place between large corporations. They can afford lawyers, and also they could have a dedicated IT department. We cannot expect that kind of sophistication from mass consumers when they give up their information. So I think that this could be another issue in the market economy. Now then, identifying problem might be easy, but what would be the solution? This could be more difficult problem. One thing I'd like to mention is that we talk a lot about government intervention in regulation, but I think there should be also some kind of like a technological solution to this problem. If you remember, like in 1990s, there was a lot of discussion about piracy, and at that time, all people thought that actually the music industry, it is the end of the world, okay? But somehow, they survived. Of course, there was some high-profile cases where actually music companies are going after college students, and it became being used. But there's also another technological solution, which is something called like a digital rights management. I'm not saying this is a perfect solution, but let's say take an example like Spotify. Okay, so if you are a premium subscriber, probably you can download the music on your phone, and actually you can use it offline. Okay? But once you discontinue your service, maybe you cannot play it anymore. So in other words, there is some kind of a technology that will make that kind of a, in a sense, make information obsolete. Okay? I don't know whether this kind of a technology can be developed to minimize the kind of information problem we are talking about. So basically, making information less durable. That could be another route we can think about. Yeah.
Andre, why don't we come back to you, because this leads into Sarit's point, I think, which is maybe these companies aren't in such a durable market position. Maybe there is a technological solution. You've been doing some thinking about that. And before I leave it to you, I want you guys to think about whether Carl and Fiona are sort of fundamentally right about the harm here not being a question of market position, but really a question of kind of the firm's product offerings and their data and their market position rather than, and so do you agree with them fundamentally that this really kind of isn't an antitrust question? But well, I'll come back to that. So is there some kind of, is there a technological solution on the horizon that could destabilize these companies?
So I'm not going to talk about technological solution that Jay was thinking about, but what I'm thinking about, and this is something that actually came up early this morning, is this idea of decentralized apps. And when you're thinking about the blockchain technology that is becoming more and more popular, many are talking about how the idea of decentralization, that the blockchain technology is going to allow us, is going to enable customers to actually own their own data. And then when I own my own data, I can really think about who am I going to give it to and how much I'm going to charge for it, or what do I want to get in return. And that in a way also going to help us touch on the discussion that Joshua was talking about before in terms of do we actually, so when we're thinking about value creation, when we're thinking about these platforms, are they actually really creating value? And if consumers would not feel or do not feel that they're creating value, then we're going to see them switching very quickly to other alternatives that are going to allow them to control their data. But if you're thinking about Uber, for example, I think that Uber is a great example of an app that, or an intermediary that is really matching the drivers and riders. And this is something that we can do with an open source app that where if we're doing it on a blockchain technology, it's going to be relatively easy to do. But then what this open source app, what this intermediary not going to be able to allow us, or is not going to offer, the service that is not going to offer is not going to tell us whether our driver is actually a serial killer or not. They're not going to do some due diligence on their drivers so that the hopefully current ride-sharing intermediaries are doing. So there is some value that these apps, that these intermediaries are providing, whether it's organizing the internet or whether it's doing a better job in terms of the matching when we're thinking about Google, for example. And then once you open it with the technologies that are now available and are going to, again, become more and more popular, we're going to see that we're going to be able to do a lot of this matching, but the question is whether this is going to offer the same value that the current companies are actually offering, and that's going to help us also measure what is the value that these companies are, that these intermediaries are actually creating nowadays for customers.
Okay, great. So Fiona and Carl, I want to ask you guys the question that I asked Macon Delrahim at lunch, which is, he had a cry sort of similar to you, which, Carl, you know, I want to see some evidence here. And why do we not have the evidence that you're talking about with, why do we not have the evidence that would provide a theory of harm from these companies? Is it because they're not exploiting their market position? And in fact, so they're not creating some kind of market harm, that the only harms are, you know, privacy violations. Is it because economists are not asking these questions for some reason? Are they because it wasn't a popular subject until only recently? Is it because they're getting they're captured in some way? Why do we not have the evidence that we need to assess whether these companies are abusive?
I think if you look historically at antitrust cases, major antitrust cases, they come from, in the United States, the antitrust agencies doing deep, rather long investigations with subpoena power. And the European Commission would be the same. They haven't been doing it for quite as long, maybe 25 or 30 years versus 100 years. And so it's asking a lot to, say, academics, let's say, to do a study and uncover some of the stuff, because it's pretty detailed and it tends to be confidential information.
That's right. It's, you know, how are we supposed to know what's going on with Facebook's acquisitions and the motivations for those and the modeling behind them and the thought behind them as an outside person? I mean, I think that's just not reasonable to imagine is happening.
Look, so on acquisitions, you know, people do raise questions when they come up because those are public, okay? But to do the detailed analysis, you usually need basically confidential information. That's what the agencies are able to do under the Hart-Scott-Rodino Act. For conduct cases, I would take Amazon. Okay, so my first question would be, well, are they pricing stuff below cost systematically? Okay, I don't know what their costs are. I don't know, how do I do that, right? You'd have to go into their data, I think, to test that. What's their market share in different areas? Are they getting so much market share? Even measuring market share can be pretty hard, okay? So, and then some of the other modes of conduct, well, we haven't really heard exactly what they were, but even the Google stuff that I've worked on, like I said, you know, it's pretty detailed, all right, what are the policies and how was the advertising, you know, sold, and I mean, you know, Yelp, for example, has put out some interesting stuff about Google, you know, that's suggestive, and I think that's one example of evidence. I mean, Luther Lowe is here, I think, and he's done a great job with that. So there are examples of that. In that case, it's another company in the same space who's aware of the impact and has done some studies. But I think you really have to expect it's something the antitrust agencies will do, or occasionally private actions, you know, private plaintiffs who can bring cases. But you need to dig in and it's at that level of detail.
And so to answer your question specifically, do we think there's no evidence because there's no harm? I think we haven't looked, so it's premature to say we know whether there's harm. I think economists are asking, and maybe some are captured, but most are not and are interested. But I think that what Del Rahim's answer really pointed out was that he seems to think he's in a circle where he wants us to come up with the evidence so that he can open an investigation, but opening an investigation would be the way you would get the evidence. And so if he's waiting for us to deliver him the evidence, we're kind of stuck. I mean, nothing's going to happen if that's really how he imagines this is going.
But complaining companies are a way to break through that, right? I mean, you know, both the DOJ and FTC, you know, always say we're open to hearing complaints, and of course that doesn't mean they're going to swallow them whole, but they'll consider it.
So let me ask a slightly sensitive question. Both of you served in the Obama administration. Why did the Obama administration not conduct more aggressive investigations with their subpoena power into these companies as they were rising to become much more powerful?
I can answer some of that. I'm a little safer than Carl because he was the first one in the job under Obama. I think what people don't fully appreciate is the state of antitrust enforcement when Obama took office. So I'll tell you one vignette. apparently on the first day of the new administration, if you wanted to schedule a conference call, if you were DOJ and you wanted to schedule a conference call, you had to fax a request for your conference call to the conference call department 24 hours in advance of the time you wanted to hold the conference call. Okay, so we're not really talking about cutting edge frontier, let's worry about Facebook issues. We're talking about, can we get ourselves organized enough to really enforce the law? And I think if you look at the reinvigoration of litigation under Christine Varney and then Joe Wayland and other people like that, and you look at the merger track record of the Obama administration at the Department of Justice, it's 100%. Right? Every single merger challenge that was brought was won. So a lot of sort of change and, in my view, kind of more the good stuff happened. Maybe we didn't get all the way.
Well, as much as I'd like to hide behind Fiona's answer, I will add to it. So in spring 2009, I went to DOJ, and Christine Varney was the Assistant Attorney General. She was confirmed the next month in April. Okay, and one of her first things she did within weeks was she rescinded the report on Section 2 monopolization that had been put out at the end of the Bush administration by the Justice Department, which was seen in many as overly restrictive of what making it harder to bring Section 2 cases. So she rescinded that, which was notable. And she gave a speech which picked up the front page of the New York Times as, okay, Obama administration, they're here, they're going to go after all these big companies. Okay. And let's just say about 2 weeks later, I gave a speech, much less noted for very good reason, I'm sure, where I presented the data on how many Section 2 cases the Justice Department had brought over the previous 20 years. Okay. And the answer was like less than one a year. And they're not even ones, I mean, some of them you wouldn't even heard of. They're Section 2 cases, but one would be kind of a local
United Regional Hospital of Wichita Falls.
Yeah, right, okay. So they're
Who
not
doesn't
like
remember
Microsoft.
that?
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
So I was basically saying, look, the reality is you don't end up with very many of these cases, and once a decade or so, maybe you have a big one, an IBM or an AT&T or a Microsoft. But if you think the Justice Department is going to have a regular series of these, you're going to be disappointed. Now, we could ask whether that's a failure of enforcement or not, but let's just say the DOJ gets a certain number of leads and they follow them, and some of them don't pan out. We had a number of things we looked at quite closely that in the end up we didn't pursue. Okay, that's what I know, and I always say to people, look, if you are aware of some case you think we missed, tell me what it was. Okay.
So do you guys agree, to my left here, that these market failures that you've identified are sort of fundamentally not really questions of antitrust enforcement, that they're something else, and if so, then would lead to regulation or not? Do you want to?
So can I just talk about one issue?
Yes, you may.
So I'll talk about one antitrust issue when product is once again free or at zero price. So I mean, this morning Fiona mentioned about potential negative price. Okay, so one issue with negative price is something called consumer's moral hazard. Actually, in some market, actually we can find a negative price. For instance, in the credit card market, I'm sure that you all get the credit card with free annual membership, and also whenever you spend some money, you are going to get some rebate and also points. I mean, these can be considered as a negative price. But in the credit card market, actually there is some built-in mechanism to prevent a moral hazard. And for instance, you are not going to spend $100 to get just a $1 rebate, okay? No one will be that stupid. But imagine the case where actually Google pays you some money for every search you do because they can get some advertising revenue. If that is the case, then you will find some people sitting in front of a computer all day long with random words, and also maybe they might come up with some kind of software, okay, to do automatically. So now think about Google's business model. Google's business model is that when somebody types in some words to some query, that will reveal what kind of information, what kind of things they want. Okay, so that is how they can do so-called targeted advertising. But once people are typing random numbers, random words, okay, so then basically no advertiser will be willing to pay, and basically the Google's business model will just collapse. Okay, so there could be some restriction why a price cannot be negative. And then this brings it to the issue of tying and the bundling in this market. So I think this is appropriate to talk about here at Chicago School, because Chicago School has very, great insight about time. So consider, so this is something called the leverage theory of time. So basically, when you have a monopoly in one market, whether you can extend that monopoly power to another market. So in the previous panel session, we talked about a lot about this one. Okay, so now the Chicago School, argument is the following. Okay, suppose that there are two products. Okay, the typical story is one firm has a monopoly power, let's say in market A, but the firm is facing competition in another product, market B. Okay, so suppose that these two products are complementary. Okay, meaning that consumers need both products. Otherwise, they will not get any utility. Okay, so if that is the case, then it is automatic that you can monopolize the second market. Okay, why? Because you are going to sell your monopolized product only on the condition consumers also buy product B. Okay, so then consumers cannot just buy product B. Okay, it will be just useless. So you can, when two products are complementary, you can automatically you can extend your monopoly power. Okay, but the more interesting question is whether the monopoly will have actually incentive to do that. Okay, so that is a different question, and this is where the Chicago School insight is coming in. Actually, the Chicago School says that, well, you can extend your monopoly power to the second market, but you will have no incentive to do that. Okay, so the logic is the following. Okay, if there is more competition in, let's say, product market B, okay, and let's say the price has gone down, okay, then as a result, actually you can actually increase your monopolized product. Okay, so actually you can get higher profit. Okay, so the more competition there, actually you are going to have a higher profit. So what is the mechanism here? The mechanism is what is called a price squeeze. Okay, price squeeze means that you can just squeeze down the other product market, and you can drag up in the other market. But once the price is equal to zero, then there's nothing to depress, and also there's nothing to increase. So actually, in this kind of market, actually, the Chicago School, the insight, okay, this can actually fail, and actually there could be some room for incentive to bundle. And so I think this kind of logic might be actually useful in actually the Google Android case. So Google Android case, actually, Android is free software, but there is something called the MADA, which stands for Mobile Application Distribution Agreement. So according to this clause, well, if you install any Google app, actually you have to install everything. Okay, so this is basically all or nothing proposition. Okay, you cannot just select a few Google apps. You cannot do that. So either you install everything or you install nothing. Okay. So in the smartphone case, what is really important is Google Play Store, which is where you can actually download all the apps. Okay. If you cannot download the apps, then your phone is not smart anymore. Okay. So basically, this is the kind of like a proposition given by the Google, and I think this might be actually some important implication.
So just as an example, there is a browser that's called Brave that is offering to pay you for your searches. So it's doing exactly the idea of these negative prices that Fiona mentioned before, and we don't see it being. And they have all the stats to show you that they're going to be faster than any of the other browsers that are out there. But we don't see a lot of adoption of it. And again, I think that it goes back to, it might be an awareness issue, but it might be also the case that consumers just feel that the value proposition, that the value creation might not be high enough. And to Jay's second point in terms of in terms of leveraging your market power, what we might see them doing is actually using this market power in order to increase the prices to the advertisers, right? So they're not, we're not going to see the effect maybe on the consumer side, but there might be some effects going on the advertiser side. And then, but I think that everybody is so focused on the consumer side that they might not be really thinking about the advertiser side, where it might be the case that this is where the conduct might be. So.
Mm-hmm. Do you want to have something to add?
Yeah, so I want to go back to your question about antitrust versus other public policy issues.
Yeah.
I think they're both there. But I think just focusing on antitrust with these companies, I think is really dangerous. I mean, there are certain market failures which I think were there. Were there before they became big. Of course, all of these, so even the market failures, obviously they're more of a concern when these companies become big. But I mean, there's a little parallel here maybe with the financial crisis in the sense a lot of the, as I was listening to Jay, a lot of the examples of market failures that we worry about with these platforms, they have something to do with information disclosure, with basically being asymmetric information between the platform and how they operate and the general public. So do you fully understand when you sign up for Facebook? First of all, do you understand how much data you're giving them, what they're doing with the data? The answer is probably 90%. I have no clue what's happening. There was a very good example, an article a couple weeks ago. So basically, Facebook tried to defend themselves with saying, oh, but we had data policies. I mean, we weren't just giving data left and right. We actually had policies that stipulated if you're a third-party advertiser or app on Facebook, and if you get data, which, if you're an app or advertiser on Facebook, you get data about users. Our policy says you can only use that data, and I'm really quoting here, you can only use that data to enhance your product or your service on top of Facebook. You can't use that data outside. That sounds reasonable. Except when you think about it, it's like, how exactly are you enforcing this? Like, where exactly is, like, okay, that sounds like a very good principle, but it's like, how is Facebook policing what I do with the data once I got it off Facebook? And this is exactly, obviously, the Cambridge Analytica case. It has no instruments. So to me, this is an example in which basically Facebook, at some point, they probably put that in there, said this should be enough to give us plausible deniability. And I'm sure because people don't really understand how this works. I mean, I don't think they fully understood themselves, but probably more than the general public. So to me, it has to, I mean, there has to be, I mean, right now, I would just worry about, they should be held to high standards in terms of explaining exactly what's happening. I just don't think people understand exactly how this is being, how data is being used, and I think that's that's one of the main issues. And I don't think that's necessary. I mean, it's in addition and somewhat orthogonal to antitrust, to market structure.
Yeah.
I just want to echo that. It seems to me that we're all learning how much of our data is being used and all the things that can be done when it's combined through all these different sources. We heard some pretty scary, and before we even get to being manipulated, okay? So this, I think of this as a consumer protection issue more than an antitrust issue, or at least in the first instance, a consumer protection issue.
Yeah.
So it seems to me there's a lot to be said for educating the public about what is now possible with their data, and so are you really okay with that?
Yeah.
Okay. And if that happens, then I would hope there'd be demand for either these big incumbent companies or perhaps entrants to cater to people like, no, that's creepy. I don't want that anymore.
Agreed.
Give me an option.
Agreed.
But the market isn't working there yet because the demand isn't there yet because people will sell so much, they're giving away this data for a nickel or an eighth of a penny, I heard, or whatever it's worth. And I think we all need to be thinking and telling people, do you want to do that anymore?
So something that hasn't come up so much in this conference, which I think is really important, is all the work that's been done over the last 25 years in behavioral economics.
Yes.
Because some of what we're expecting is for the consumer to look at the privacy policy, make an evaluation of what she wants, decide how much it's worth, make trade-offs. And I think people are just saying, wait a minute, I'm trying to look up a pizza place because I'm starving. And I'm just going to click yes to get to an answer because I need that thing right now.
Or the story of getting the receipt, right? That Luigi said.
Luigi was informed about this, and still he's held hostage, right?
Exactly. And so there are a lot of known biases that people have, and it would be very interesting to interact what we know about all of that with these privacy settings, because I just don't think consumers are very good Moreover, this morning there was a lot of discussion of kids online. I mean, I'm not letting my teenagers make these decisions. They make terrible decisions.
Right.
They're not old enough to know what's good for them. They have to be told to eat their vegetables. They probably need to be told some things like this too. So that's another.
You think they're paying attention to what you're telling
and
Anyway, I just think there's
I'm
a lot.
sure they appreciate all the
Yeah,
all the
exactly.
advice that okay, so let's talk.
I want to add something
Okay,
that,
go ahead.
you know, and again, I think I keep going back to this value creation because there is actually also some value being created with all of this data. The example I want to give is actually Uber Eats. So with Uber Eats, what they do is that also they collect data of when do we eat and what do we eat and what do we like. But what they're using this data for, I don't know if they make teenagers eat vegetables, but what they do is that they actually identify that some markets are short on fried chicken, for example. So they're going to approach a pizza place and tell them, you know what, there isn't a lot of competition in the fried chicken market here. So if you want to start offering fried chicken, this is going to be a good market for you to do that, which is going to increase competition, on some level. So I think that there are good uses of data and there are bad uses of data, and I think that it's important to also kind of make this distinction, which just makes it obviously way more complex because now when you're ordering your pizza, do I want to share that or don't I want to share it? Because on one hand it might increase competition, but then on the other hand they might know whether I like mushroom.
Price discrimination.
Yes, exactly.
So I just want to come back to having a stronger point of view on regulation. So I completely agree with Carl. I mean, this is, to me right now, I would take this view, this should be under consumer protection. I wouldn't go as far as say, I wouldn't go further than that. There can be bad uses of data, good uses of data. We just don't know, but I would impose something under consumer protection. And what we hope is that with the increased transparency that results from that, you will get either people are just going to be creeped out or they're going to turn to alternative services. So it basically makes competition more efficient. And hopefully that takes care of some of these issues.
Okay, so now I want to spend the last leg of the panel on what that regulation, what that consumer protection might look like, and then we'll open it up for questions. So prepare. But okay, so let's propose for a second. Put away antitrust for a second. I don't necessarily think we need to entirely, but what does the consumer protection framework look like? Who administers it? And what do you think the things that have been proposed out there are strong, and what hasn't been proposed yet that needs to be? Who wants to take that first?
So I'm not going to opine on who should run it because that's too hard. But I do have a few favorites. One is I think it's been shown in the behavioral literature that defaults really matter. So I think setting the defaults to be, for example, you have to opt in, not that you have to take an affirmative stance to opt out. That would make a big difference. I think the consumer owning her data and in particular being able to receive it in an interoperable form and take it to the competitor or take it to the entrant, I think that's hugely important. So if I like certain foods at certain times of day or my bank activity or whatever, to be able to receive that in a standardized format and take it to the competing bank strikes me as a really important way to incentivize entry and competition.
And when you have defaults and opting in, do the consumers, how do we have the consumer understand whether, because I sort of opt in some ways by clicking terms of service, right? But I don't really have any
those terms
choice.
of service are a really big problem, I think. I mean, they're just not feasible to read for regular people. I don't know what we're learning from those, really.
You don't read them carefully?
Did not read.
Carl, do you want to take a stab at who or what or both?
Well, I'll take a quick stab. First up, it seems like the Federal Trade Commission is a good place to start because that is the agency that has consumer protection authority. They can do rulemakings if they choose.
Which they haven't.
Which they have not done, and we'll see whether they choose to do so. When Congress set up the FTC in 1914, they were serious. They gave them a lot of authority, but a lot of it's been has been laid foul. Okay.
Well, I want to get to whether any of this is going to happen in a second.
Okay.
I want to ask, what can they do? Let's say you are czar of the FTC, and you throw out all the other
I'll mention a couple
commissions.
things. First of all, I think the data portability is good. I think selling data to third parties should be pretty hard to do unless the person really approves it. Okay, I think we can probably learn. I know there's been a lot of criticism of the European data privacy rule. We're going to hear more about it tomorrow, I think. But something there, the notion of ownership, and the user has more knowledge to find out what the data is and to limit its use. I think those are all good things. And what about some sort of liability here, right? Why not liability for breaches and losses of the data that maybe there'd be something that could be a harsher, tougher.
Do you think Facebook has already violated the FTC consent decree, and could the FTC go to a judge now and say you violated and we're going to start to fine?
I get that they were looking into it. I don't know the terms of this consent decree, but I'm talking about bigger fish than that. That's backward looking. I'm talking about some regime that wouldn't apply just to people who entered into a consent decree, right? It'd be a liability for everybody, or a rule that would apply prospectively to everybody.
So you've been thinking about, are these technological solutions that you're sort of hoping for, are they sufficient, or do you think that there should be regulation? What would that look like?
So I actually think that the regulation is one side of it, but I think that education is another side of it. And I think that just educating, and this is kind of like to Andre's point in terms of what do people understand that they're giving and what they don't understand. And I think that education is going to be a very important part of it. And I think that even when you think about the blockchain technology, what the blockchain technology can do is it can actually really give you this identity, digital identity that we were talking about earlier today. But I think that this digital identity comes with lots of responsibility in terms of I need to know that there is just so much data on me that what will happen, so the blockchain technology is supposed to be immutable, okay? But lots of things are supposed to be doing a better job than what they do. So when you get to data breaches, when you're getting to a lot of these data being stored somewhere, and then you start thinking about who's going to be responsible for to this information. And if it's the 16-year-old who's been collecting all of this data, through these 16 years, and now someone is offering them something for this data, I think that educating consumers in terms of what exactly are the harms to giving this data it might be even more important than antitrust, because yes, there are some things that you can do in terms of limiting companies in terms of what they can or cannot do with the data, but I think that also making sure that consumers understand what exactly can be done with this data and what giving this data actually means. And I think that, again, the blockchain technology is going to be great in terms of having you own your own data, but it does not solve the problem, because even if you own the data but you don't understand what exactly are the implications of giving it, that's going to still be an issue.
So blockchain isn't just for getting my deliveries of heroin. That's good to know. Andre and Jay, do you guys want to weigh in on kind of the regulatory solutions? Did you have a?
Well, I think that. Okay.
Go ahead. No, go ahead.
Maybe I think the best solution might be actually self-regulation by the industry. But I'm
self-regulation.
Self-regulation, but I'm not naive enough to believe that it will happen. So I think that there's some kind of a regulation is, I think, inevitable. But I think that, industry itself should also, try their best to self-regulate. And then in terms of regulation, we know that actually in Europe, there is a new privacy regulation actually that will be implemented next month. And I read some of them, it also seems to have some good element. For instance, one example might be data portability. So in any case, that is already, it will be implemented. Now that is now given. And considering that many firms are multinational and all those firms will be actually subject to that kind of regulation, I think that the United States should also look at that regulation and then maybe try to at least try to harmonize to reduce the burden of the firms.
But given that data, you were saying data is infinitely replicatable, does data portability have to have an element where you say, and you, Google, need to delete all my data? And is that workable, or is that is there any technological?
I know that's what I'm talking about. Yeah, whether there should be some technological, solution to that kind of problem, so that actually as a consumer, you own your own data, and actually you can dictate how it can be used. So I don't know whether there can be some technological solution to that. I'm not sure.
Andre, do you want to weigh in?
Sure. So I think I broadly agree with what Fiona mentioned. I'll just bring up, for the sake of argument, I think it's important to, so the two elements you mentioned were data portability, I completely agree, and more information. So on data portability, I think, and we can have this debate, right? But there's some elements of the data that's being created. I mean, it's not as easy as we think, right? I mean, there's some elements which are clearly mine. If you think about Facebook data, like the names of my friends. But there are other elements of the data which Facebook will argue. Basically, it's data that's completely unique to Facebook. It's been created on Facebook. It's unclear how you assign ownership of the data. So I think it's not as, I mean, I would err on the side of giving more control to users. And by the way, it's not just social networks data. There's another case that I followed closely, was the so Equifax breach, so data about credit. So that's another one where consumers actually have no idea what data is going in there, and I think that's egregious. I mean, you basically have no clue how your credit goes up and down. So I think there should definitely be some some information, some mandatory information disclosure for how this data works, and some ownership to consumers. On providing more information, I think I would just resort to, I don't know, give a math quiz or something to people before. There's this movie, The Internship, that says you should solve a hard math problem before you text someone, just to make sure to prevent drunk.
On Facebook might drop dramatically.
Yes.
Yeah, I know that's completely unrealistic, but some sort of education, getting around what you mentioned, the collective action problems. I mean, the fact that I may think, even if I understand what's going on, I may think, just giving my small data for ordering a pizza, who cares, right? But that's because I'm ignoring the effects on other, the aggregate effect. So just making sure that people understand that this data gets aggregated and it becomes something really powerful is very important.
Okay, so there's a general consensus that there needs to be some kind of regulation here, and I think that's one of the most surprising things that I've taken from the entire day is that almost everyone, including Dennis Carlton, embraced some form of regulation.
Do we think the agreement is regards Facebook, or is it broader than that, actually?
Yeah, fair enough.
I think you're right.
We're all thinking about Facebook.
You're right.
I'm not sure that it extends to which other companies that might extend to.
I think it sounded to me like Facebook, yes, Google, probably, Amazon, maybe not. A lot of debate about it.
Wait, sorry, I understood. Okay, so can we all go around and see what each of us understood? Because I'm not sure it's the same.
And,
I mean, I think Facebook, definitely. Google, I'm open to, but I don't know quite what it would be. But again, I think having control over people's data, that should be general.
Yeah, I mean, I would say it's very confusing to imagine one regulation for one company and another for another. I'd be more comfortable with we have a
blanket,
United States
blanket
policy, and everyone complies with it.
Okay, so
that's what I was getting at. Yeah.
Okay, so
the implications might be very, very different for different companies.
Right. For antitrust, I'm fine going to there's market, but for this consumer protection stuff, I think that one I view it as it doesn't matter if it's Twitter or anyone that basically relies on data, you should be subject to these rules.
Okay. So the last topic before I open up for questions is what. So capture was mentioned maybe once today. Political capture. Donald Trump's name was mentioned 2 or 3 times. There is this remarkable consensus now forming that these companies are a problem to some extent, with varying degrees of agreement, Facebook leading and data having a problem. But how realistic do we think that there's going to be any regulation in any serious way in the foreseeable future, and why or why not? Carl.
Well, I think as far as I understand these things, what we're talking about now would require probably some act of Congress. Maybe the FTC could have some rulemaking, but I don't know how far that could go. So the notion of this current Congress passing a major new form of regulation, given that regulation is essentially a 4-letter word, seems pretty damn low.
Does anyone disagree on the panel?
Yeah.
Right. So, and is that ideological, or is it capture? Well, you said that very quietly. Yeah.
Well, I mean, as I said this morning, I think one of the difficulties of coming to solutions like the one sort of this room is discussing is that the firms who make money off of the status quo will take that money. I mean, there's plenty of economic models explaining this. I have monopoly profit, and I'm willing to spend up to the last dollar of my monopoly profit to protect my monopoly profit. So if I can lobby members of Congress, if I can talk about how great the tech industry is, if I can, you know, there's going to be many strategies like that that will delay or eliminate attempts to make these changes.
And so do these, go ahead.
Actually, I have one question, actually. In the congressional hearing on Facebook, actually what caught my attention was Mark Zuckerberg's response to the possibility of regulation. Actually, what he said, I mean, he seemed to be actually ready to accept the regulation. But what he said was that actually, well, we can afford to adhere to any regulation. We can afford to do that. But regulation, you should not to regulate so that to kill small entrant firms.
Right.
This is a completely opposite to what we think about regulation used by big firms, especially Chicago School. They think that incumbent firms will use actual regulation to kill entrants.
Yeah.
But I don't know, I mean, what was in his mind? He seemed to be more care about potential entrants rather than Facebook. He seemed to be saying that actually, where Facebook was also a small company years back, so you should not, you should be very careful not to use the regulation. It was completely, I don't know.
Which is
the rhetoric around regulation in this country is really amusing to watch because it's always presented as firms don't like regulation because they want to, you know, dump pollution in the river or something like that. I think the opposite is very often true. Firms love regulation because very often the regulation keeps the competitors out or does something very useful. And so I think we really need to be much more nuanced when we talk about regulation.
Did you want to add something?
Yeah, no, I'm just thinking, you know, when you think about Facebook, a lot of, you know, when you think about their acquisitions, a lot of what's happening with Facebook is these acquisitions of new technologies, innovations, and so on, which allows them to just pick and choose rather than do it themselves. So they definitely don't want to kill that. So.
Okay, so let's open it up with questions. You first, the lady right there. Yeah.
Thank you. Do you listen?
I think.
Yeah. Okay. This is a question for Carl and Fiona. As an alternative solution, while data regulation of whatever kind comes into place, Macon was saying today that there's a consensus between antitrust agencies in terms of protecting consumer welfare, and that basically we don't have any cases because the theory of harm is not clear. There's nothing. But my question is, when you talk about consumer welfare, that could be shorted as lowering prices, or it could be expanded a little bit more in terms of not just lower prices, but also bigger quantity, higher quality innovation, and maybe put into that basket privacy as a quality issue. So then what do you think of an idea of bringing in a case for abuse of dominance in terms of using that privacy data? So then if you have a case like that, one of the remedies could be to the specific companies you're investigating to be to give the data to third parties and give it and have it in a interoperability way. Maybe that could work.
So let me just respond. The consumer welfare standard definitely includes quality and innovation.
And
already,
privacy?
For sure. So privacy, to the extent that consumers value that and it's an element of quality, then it's in there already. We can consider that just under normal operating procedures would be my first response.
So then you could have a Facebook case?
And let me just then say one more thing about data. I think if you consider data to be an asset, like a factory or a truck, you can also deal with data under current law. I mean, if the remedy to the merger is, the factories are going to be combined and that's going to lessen competition, so we want you to divest a factory, you can make the exact same argument with data.
Well, for example, you could imagine, I think it would be fine to have a merge if Facebook were doing an acquisition. It could be the theory of harm could be this other company would be putting competitive pressure on them to give more favorable privacy policies to their customers, and those were lost. That would be consumer harm, and that would be a basis potentially for challenge having nothing to do with prices.
That's a merger, but you both are talking about mergers. What about
Privacy.
anti-competitive conduct?
Well, I think that there's a distinction here, definitely between the US and the EU. We don't tend to think of simply charging a high price as an abusive monopoly position, exploitative. Okay, but in the European Union, that's a possibility more under the law. And so having, let's say, privacy rules that are really unfavorable to your customers, that'd be like charging a high price. That would not in the US typically be itself an abuse. So when you're getting abused, my question then would become, what did they do wrong?
Yeah.
And simply saying, I don't like their privacy policies is not a sufficient answer.
I agree.
Here we need an exclusionary conduct.
Yeah.
All right. Why don't we take two questions, Dick and then Austin?
I just have a quick comment, and that is, if you're worried about data and who has it, it goes way beyond Facebook, right?
Yeah.
If you belong to the CVS Extra Care loyalty program, they know everything you bought at a drugstore. Your bank knows every check you've written, if you still write checks.
Yeah.
Your credit card issuer knows everything you bought, and it goes on. Uber knows where you go.
Agreed.
So the issue of data goes deep in the economy these days. And that to me says, if you don't want to make a regulatory policy that favors the very large firms, it needs to be pretty simple. And that requires some thought. My distant impression of the European directive is it's not simple. And US firms will be complying with it if they do business in Europe, and that's a cost of doing business. But that may be a cost of doing business that's hard for small firms to bear. So I think in thinking about data policy here, transparency and all that, it's got to be simple or it will entrench the large firms.
And I totally agree with that. I think one simple rule would be significant liability if you lose my data.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. Another would be, no, you cannot provide my data to any third party unless, I have sworn in blood and I'm somehow informed or something, okay, which could not as simple as I might like, but those are the sort of things I have in mind, not some more complicated thing.
Could you use, and you may want to have a rule for this too, I don't provide your data, but an advertiser wants to target people with certain characteristics. I will run it through my database without giving names.
That's what they do now.
I can target. Now, you may want to opt out of that too.
Well, that gets interesting. The other thing is if you have a rule regarding third parties and you can't cross corporate boundaries, it tends to advantage the larger firms.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I think your general point that whatever we do should be really attentive to the competitive implications, not just the consumer protection implications, is a really important principle.
Awesome.
In a way, the premise of Dick's question first was the observation, there are a lot of platforms in the world. They're not just Facebook and Google are platforms. And so my question, I guess it's tilted more toward the antitrust folks. I can see that a series of things are more consumer protection and not really antitrust. But let's think of the bread and butteriest, most antitrust things we have, like mergers. We have merger guidelines, we have a consumer welfare standard. Does it matter when platforms go to merge what the second side of the platform is in the following sense? Apple's a platform. There are others, they got consumers, Their other side are these app developers. And consumers like apps. So to the extent that we're saying there's a consumer welfare standard and they're going to get monopsony and it's going to lead to shutting down some of these developers, there's an obvious consumer harm that there won't be as many apps. And maybe you could argue that on Amazon, if they have a platform, the other side of their platform are these merchants. But anything that's advertising based, which in our discussion here is all hovering around data on advertising based platforms, I'm confused. I don't exactly know what is the impact of consumers don't like ads. So if I told you we're going to merge to monopoly and they're going to raise the price of the ads and there will be fewer ads,
that's great.
In a way that's good for consumers. So how do we square platforms where the other side is negative on consumers? How do we square that with merger guidelines and consumer welfare standards?
I think the way they say it is consumers like the ads that they respond to. Namely, you didn't realize you wanted this pair of shoes, and now I've shown you this ad for the pair of shoes and you buy them. That was an ad you wanted to see. And that's better than vinyl siding, which you did not want to buy. Therefore, it's a consumer welfare improvement. That's my loose understanding of how these arguments go.
Two reactions, Austin. First, we have to wait to see what the Supreme Court says in the Amex case, which is going to be very important here on the two-sided analysis. The decision's coming in a month. Second, I'm ruling your question out of order. That is proper for the master's class, not for this class. Really complicated.
Okay, in back, the woman there.
Thank you. So I really appreciated your thoughts on, where are the Section 2 violations? And I'm a tech policy fellow with Mozilla, and I've been asking that for like the past 9 months and getting similar responses. But one of the other responses I get, and I heard this a bit when I took a trip out to the Bay Area and talking to VCs, was, these little small startups, if they're faced with like something that one of these companies is doing that's very anti-competitive, they're probably not going to dwell on it, and they're just going to move on and find something else. So one, is that a problem? I mean, are they just going to find innovation elsewhere, and so innovation will thrive, or are we maybe losing out on potential innovation because there is not, because it's not coming to light? And I guess the third question is, do we need some sort of like pro bono army of lawyers to talk to like place in startups to be able to identify, what companies might be doing to kind of shut off this competition before it even gets off the ground?
It's a very good question. You guys should be able, jump in if you want, but I just elaborate that there is it's more than anecdotal. So patent applications are down. It looks like small business formation is down. It seems like there's something going on in the economy that might speak to this.
Well, I would say, look, if startups and small companies are steering clear of some of these giants because they're afraid they'll be squashed through some sort of anti-competitive conduct, that's a concern. Even though they may find some other thing to do, sure, that's a concern. I mean, you're reducing competition and innovation in some important space. People said that 20 years ago about Microsoft, okay? And then some people say that now.
It happened, the stage got over it.
Yeah, and one of the panelists tomorrow is Gary Reback, who's a lawyer who assembled a lot of the small squashed people in the Microsoft case, and so you might want to ask him that question again tomorrow.
The really hard thing, though, is distinguish sort of somebody says, well, is there really a case there, or is it just somebody like, well, I didn't like this, that, or the other thing, and they're kind of complaining? It's so hard to know from outside.
But you would never be able to, in our framework, you would never be able to make a legal case where you're a small startup and you say, I decided not to do this, which was going to be a really brilliant idea because of the power of Facebook and Google. It's just not feasible because you could never show that that was going to be a profitable. You wouldn't have the emails. You have no ability to discover their evil plans inside when you get discovery. So is antitrust asking the wrong questions and holding itself to some kind of standard that is impossible to prove or demonstrate? And you should be just more aggressive and start blocking.
It's not the wrong question.
Uh-huh.
Assembling the evidence, you're right, can be challenging. And that's why it usually takes time. And that's why these cases, when they happen, are big changes. The Microsoft case is famous. Why? Because it assembled a lot of these theories and evidence in one place. And
Look, the Congress intended to try to encourage these sort of private cases by having treble damages in antitrust suits. Okay, so that was a way to encourage it. Okay. On the other hand, the Supreme Court over the last 40 years has made it much, much harder for a private plaintiff to bring these cases. So it's very hard for them to do so. I think then we can talk about whether that's a mistake.
I'll take Jonathan in a second, but do you guys have anything to add?
I just think it applies to any market, right, where you have big players, and just when you think about fintech, then you have all of those small startups that need to compete against the banks, and that's going to be as hard as competing against Facebook or Amazon. Or so I think that just kind of like it's more it's a general kind of like problem, and I think that innovation just going to end up kind of like we're going to see all of these partnerships, and I think that there are solutions to that kind of like not necessarily going to be antitrust or regulation.
Like what?
Again, I think that if you have a good enough, so the examples I'm thinking about are more from fintech market, and what you see is that what fintechs are doing is that they are partnering with the banks, meaning that they understand that there are going to be things that they're going to be able to do better than the large companies that are moving slower, and there are some things that they might not have the expertise in, and so on. So, where exactly is my added value, and where exactly I can actually create something that's going to make them want to work with me rather than just imitate me.
Okay, John.
So would any of you be willing to opine on the issue that Mr. Clemens raised earlier, which is there a way to modify the Section 230 safe harbor blanket liability protection that allows these companies to do anything they want and claim it's not their fault that horrible things are happening? No.
Any takers?
No.
Well, when you put it that way, it sounds a little overly broad.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, obviously, safe harbor in the DMCA is fairly simply defined, right? And my sense was it was originally intended for a big network like Verizon, right? There's all bits flowing through it, and they really don't know what's happening in their thing. But clearly, Facebook, Google, YouTube have lots of editorial function that they perform on the content that comes through. They don't allow you to see pornography, right?
I would say that this is a slightly different topic. That is to say, we've been talking about the user data. This is more about incentives to invest. And if those investments are expropriated by platforms that don't have to pay for it and so on, then we don't have as much creativity and investment in the economy. That's a harder one and totally worth examining, but a different animal.
Okay, last question over there.
Carl, thank you for teasing local search. I just want to reiterate this as a little bit of a plug, because I do think it's a great example of where the evidence, the empirical evidence of direct consumer harm is sitting out there, and we're talking about 1.5 billion searches per day. Local search is 40% of all 40% of all search on Google has local intent, and this is consumers trying to figure out where they're going to spend their money before they put their phones in their pockets and go offline and transact with Main Street small business owners. And we have direct evidence, empirical evidence of Google basically putting its hand on the scale and siphoning users into an inferior experience and increasing search costs. And we've done a great workup on that. And so I'm curious, like,
this is Yelp, right?
Yelp is one of dozens of local search players. And I would contend that if you could decouple local somehow from Google, and it all lived under one company, it'd be mentioned in the same breath as Facebook and Amazon. So why not that? What do you see as the weakness in a local case, or the strength in a local case, Carl?
Gee, we've run out of time. So I'll read this quote from Teddy Roosevelt, which was my hope with my last chance. 1910, New Nationalism speech in Osawatomie, Kansas. Teddy Roosevelt. Combinations in industry are the result of an imperative economic law which cannot be repealed by political legislation. The effort at prohibiting all combinations has substantially failed. The way out lies not in attempting to prevent such combinations, but in completely controlling them in the interest of the public welfare. That is my answer, sir.
All right. Well, on that last dodge, but a wonderful panel, thank you very much. Let's take it out and argue it over drinks.
Thank you.
Please join us back for dinner and reception in the same room on the 6th floor.
Thank you.
We were for lunch. 621, 6th floor.